So a guy goes into a job interview, and the human resource director asks, "What do you feel is your greatest weakness?" The candidate says, "Honesty." "Well, I don't think honesty should be considered a weakness," replies the surprised HR guy. The candidate looks at him for a moment and says, "Well, I don't give a crap what you think." You see, I'm weaning myself off the profanity. Can you tell? Honesty and integrity are related, of course, but as the guy seeking a job must have learned the hard way, are not quite the same thing. Some of you know, many of you were here, when I gave a somewhat provocative sermon on day 2 of Rosh Hashanah this year. I spoke about honesty, about lies, about how Trumpism grew out of our rampant culture of BS. By the way, that's a technical term, so if you didn't hear the sermon, you can watch the recording and catch up. And I hinted that on Yom Kippur I plan to move from discussing Trump-style sincerity, which essentially means expressing whatever you feel, whenever you feel it, to as many people who listen, to talk about something more adult and more aspirational. Tonight, I want to discuss a character trait which I feel is profoundly lacking but desperately needed in American leadership, which is integrity. The recent kerfuffle between Trump and the NFL about the national anthem is a case in point. Raise your hand if you think of yourself as an optimist. That's good. How about a pessimist? It's okay. There's value to being a pessimist. Good for you. What's the expression we use? Is the glass half empty or is it half full? That's how we think of this. But there's another binary having to do with glasses. Are you a content person or are you a container person? There are people who focus on the water, the substance held within the glass. Those who support players taking a knee during the anthem, I would suggest, are content people. What does the Star-Spangled Banner mean? How about the flag? If the country represented by these symbols isn't living up to the ideals they embody, then perhaps we shouldn't venerate them. Or even if we do, maybe those who don't should be heard or acknowledged and respected. Others are container people. To them, the symbols themselves have intrinsic value. The flag and the anthem should be respected because they embody our national pride and heritage. To these people, having strong symbols helps to inspire a nation. And allegiance to these symbols, perhaps especially when we're feeling ambivalent about our patriotism, helps to shape our collective American consciousness and focus our minds on these ideals. Now, you might have guessed that I tend to be more of a contents person, but I want to be careful not to disregard the container too quickly. After all, there's no glass of water without the glass. The rabbis, too, grapple with the importance of contents and containers. The Gemara tells the story about a Caesar's daughter who approaches Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania and asks him how his wisdom, which is quite prolific, could be contained within such an ugly vessel. You see, Rabbi Yoshua was well known for, let's say, his unappealing looks. Rabbi Yoshua pointed out to her that the most expensive wine in the Caesar's house was kept in pottery. Why not in gold and silver vessels? Taking his suggestion seriously, she ordered that all the wine be transferred to gold and silver, and of course, after a short time, the wine had spoiled. We know the expression, don't judge a book by its cover. You have to read the book, you have to get to know the person to assess his or her worth. As the story suggests, when we prioritize too much a beautiful container, it can even have a corrosive effect. The person viewed in this way becomes objectified, defined by her or his vessel, which over time can even spoil the contents. But I think there's something more to this Talmudic story. There are those like Donald Trump who seem incapable of appreciating everything or anything but the container. But Jewish tradition doesn't shun those who notice and celebrate beauty. Keats' assessment that beauty is truth and truth beauty doesn't suffice for us as it did for the Greeks. But taking note of beauty is no vice. Did you know that there's a bracha for seeing a strikingly beautiful person? Shekacha lo be'olamo. Thank you, God, for bringing such splendor into the world. But there's also a bracha when you see a person who looks like Rabbi Yeshua, Mishaneh Habriot, thanking God for varying the creative enterprise. We laugh, but each of them are a bracha, because each of them were created in God's image. There's nothing intrinsically good or bad about silver or earthenware vessels. It's about the relationship between the container and the contents. Perhaps the Talmud is trying to teach us less about physical beauty per se, and more about the correlation between the part of us people see and that other part. I read a couple of wonderful books this summer. One is a novel called Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. Anyone read it? The other is a memoir by Harun Mogul called How to Be a Muslim. How about that one? Both good. Mogul is an American of Pakistani heritage, and as a student at NYU, helped build the Islamic Center there into a vibrant student organization, one that became a model for centers like it around the country. After 9/11, as a young man, he became a commentator on cable news channels as the country attempted to better understand the nature of a religion, 19 of whose purported adherents had just committed the most horrific terrorist attack in U.S. history. So it's about Harun's public persona, his speaking engagements, his meteoric rise, his container, if you will. But it's also about his private life, and mostly the disconnect between the two. You see, even as Harun was shining as an Islamic scholar and a spokesman, beneath his charming personality and sense of humor was a man deeply ashamed, struggling with depression, even suicidal. His inner life was riddled with doubt about God, about himself, his purpose, even as his container, the one he presented to the world, glistened and gleamed. Gilead is also a book about a faith leader, in this case, an aging preacher in mid-century Iowa who reflects on his life's work in a series of missives to his young child, whom he will not witness to grow into adulthood. The Pulitzer Prize-winning novel is beautifully rendered, and like How to Be a Muslim, is all about the tension between the internal and external life. In one epistle, the Reverend John Ames struggles with his stack of handwritten sermons, a lifetime of messages to his congregation, and whether he ought to burn them. He wonders if most of them really mattered at all. And he, like the non-fictional Harun Mogul, grapples with his own religious practice, his desire for material gratification, and his occasional shame at not being able to fully integrate his inner and outer life. The word integrate is etymologically related to the word integrity. What is integrity? I understand it to mean leading a coherent life, striving and, as often as possible, succeeding to unite in the most constructive way our inner and outer selves, our contents and our container. There's a Hebrew phrase to describe such coherence. It's toho kivaro. Literally, his insides match his outsides. Surprisingly, though, the expression enters the lexicon in a Talmudic tale on the lips of the story's antagonist. A brief summary. Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel is the patriarch in the 1st century. He's a leader by virtue of his aristocratic lineage. And he's the imperious sort. He doesn't like being challenged. Along comes a particular student who doesn't like an answer to a certain question and cites an alternative position of our friend our old friend Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananiah. You remember him from the other story. So Rabban Gamliel makes Rabbi Yeshua stand in the Beit Midrash in front of his students as he berates him for daring to interpret halakha the way that he does. Mortified by this public shaming of an icon, the rabbis depose Rabban Gamliel and replace him with another guy named Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And Elazar's first executive order, as it were, is to bring hundreds of benches into the Beit Midrash to accommodate all the new students. So, was Rabbi Elazar a better teacher than Rabban Gamliel? No. Why then did so many new people come to the study hall? Because Rabban Gamliel had guards stationed at the door, barring most students from entering. The thirst for learning was there, but his policy was only to teach those whose insides matched their outsides. Toho kivaro. Which policy was right? The Talmud is ambiguous. On one hand, Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Elazar are the clear protagonists of the story, and their policies are more inclusive. But then Rabban Gamliel, considering that perhaps he had tragically withheld Torah from worthy students, worthy recipients, had a strange dream in which he sees white pitchers filled with ash. Wait a second. Maybe he was right. Maybe these new students were a bunch of pretty containers with ashen contents. The sugya isn't clear. It's possible, says the Gemara, this vision came only after to placate Rabban Gamliel, to ease his mind. And in fairness, we're told on that day in the Beit Midrash, they managed to solve all kinds of previously insoluble problems. Maybe the more inclusive approach is the better one. But on the other hand, isn't there value to having an admissions policy? Surely for ability, but perhaps also for integrity. Shouldn't the leaders of tomorrow be people who are coherent beings, whose containers match their contents? What's going on here? Who's right? Who's wrong? The answer, as is so often the case, is not clear. I want to suggest that Rabban Gamliel's failing here isn't really his policy, isn't necessarily his expectation of others. It's his inability to recognize his own failings. He speaks the right words, toho kivaro, but his actions, his behaviors don't reflect this value. He embarrasses a colleague. He eschews dissenting opinions. He intimidates opponents. Later in the story, he visits Rabbi Yeshua's home to apologize, and seeing soot on his colleague's walls, he uncouthly remarks, "I didn't know that you're a smith." He's so sheltered, so bound up in his own largesse, it doesn't occur to him that not all learned men are independently wealthy, that many of them have to work in menial jobs to make ends meet. Rabban Gamliel talks the talk of integrity, but he lives a life of containers ignoring the contents. He's a failed leader because he fails to lead by example. We so need leaders with integrity right now. Not just ones with good talking points, but people who walk the walk. People like Harun Mogul, who aren't afraid to be vulnerable, who confess at struggling to achieve a coherent life, but try again and again to get it right. Instead, as Donald Trump attempts with each rally, with each hateful tweet, to fill an unfillable void, the maelstrom that swirls where his conscience should be, we are drawn repeatedly into that vortex. There is collateral damage close to the eye of the storm, we have learned. T.S. Eliot writes, "We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind and dry grass, or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. And later in the poem, between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. Idea, reality, motion, act, binaries like these can help remind us. To be human is to strive for integration, for integrity. The shadow is what happens when we fall short. And T.S. Eliot's notorious anti-Semitism is perhaps a reminder of how difficult such coherence is to achieve. The Hollow Men concludes, "This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper." I wish I knew what was going to happen in the coming weeks, in the coming months, in the coming year. I wish I was able to predict what would happen with North Korea. God willing, cooler heads than these two guys will prevail. But if I'm honest with myself, my greatest fear isn't the bang, it's the whimper. It's the gradual erosion of norms and values and virtues democracies like ours used to hold dear. The integrity of a free press, cherished and celebrated in a free society. The sanctity of the right to vote. The importance of empirical facts and the heroes who through research subject them to rigorous scientific scrutiny. The imperative to do justice for all Americans. Folks, if the vessels that hold our society cannot breathe, the wine will spoil. Tomorrow, I'll do my best to make sense of the rise of white nationalism and the ways I believe our president's failure of leadership has emboldened hateful and hollow groups of men. But even as we contemplate the incongruity of civic life, we must not forget the importance of our own personal growth. Indeed, it is all the more important right now to be the best versions of ourselves as possible because the world needs people of integrity. It needs people who are toho kivaro. God knows this country does. And the Mahzor offers us a yardstick against which we can measure our own coherence. Tomorrow we'll hear the words of Unatana Tokef. During Musaf, we'll hear that haunting melody to accompany the words, "You open the book of remembrance, and it reads itself." The great shofar is sounded, and a still small voice is heard. Hine Yom Hadin. The day of judgment is here. I've said before, the lesson of this hymn isn't about a coercive God or a punitive God. It's about intimacy. There's a standard to which we must hold ourselves and a force in the universe that calls us to account. The content of our souls, the godliness within beckons to us, asking us, pleading with us to better unite our internal and external lives. Let's make a pledge to ourselves. Let's pledge that in this coming year, anytime we feel disequilibrium that leads us to behave in disappointing ways, we'll take note and we'll pivot away from that behavior. When we experience discord that leaves us hollow, empty inside, we'll strive to find healthy influences, healthy experiences, healthy relationships to fill us up. And let's not forget that we are embodied creatures, that we are physical beings. Traditionally, we say a blessing each morning, one for our bodies and another for our souls. Asher Yartzar, thank you for making my body function the way that it should. Elohai Neshama, thank you for implanting within me this pure soul. The vessel that contains us, or the vessels that contain us, are an integral part of us. The biblical word for a person is nephesh, an ensouled body. To be a healthy human is to integrate content and containers. And so let's do that. Let's find that sweet spot between our private and our public selves. And let's find a way to bring together our physical and our spiritual existence. Good Shabbos, good Yantif. May we all be inscribed for good.